All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you guys for being here. Just got about 5 minutes, then we'll get things started. So hope you guys are having a good week and looking forward to our Thanksgiving holiday. You guys get a little bit of time back and we all get to chill for a bit, so that'll be nice. But yeah, no rush. Just get comfortable, get your viewing set up good, and then we'll be ready to go in about 4 minutes. Good morning. Welcome to class. Thank you. 2 minutes to go, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Good to see you guys. I see a few of us here. As always, just feel free to say hello if you want. Hey, Eva. Good to see you. Hope your paper's going well. I know we talked yesterday, so it seems like you're off to a good start. Hi, Senna. Good morning. All right, almost there. Okay, guys. Well, it's pretty much 9 a.m., so I'm going to let us get started. Thanks, everyone, again for being here. It seems like to this point we still have a little bit of a light attendance, but I know it is the last day before the holidays, and sometimes people have other plans that they've arranged. But anyway, we hope to see the numbers always be good. That's just for your sake, not for mine. I mean, you want to go to your classes because it's in your best interest to do well in all your classes, and attendance is a main part of that. Attendance should be easier rather than harder now that we're in the pandemic, I would argue anyway, just because you don't actually have to physically go anywhere. So show some respect and appreciation for your classes and attend them with passion, with love, with interest. That's what I think you should do, because it's more interesting and better during the 9 to 10 hour or whatever hour of the day, and whatever else a person might be choosing to do. But anyway, I know that these are recorded lectures, so you'll get them in when you can. But just remember, that's advice for you to carry through life. Go to stuff, do stuff, be there. Just try to attend. That's always the best policy. Someday the pandemic will be over, and these words will maybe have a little bit more impact. But that's okay. So welcome back, everyone. Thanks so much for your attendance, as usual. So we just have to finish off this topic of the philosophy of mind today. That's the goal. We have a little bit of material left. We just have one more author. So we're going to try and cover the writing of Alan Turing today. And that's also something that can be applied to the essay on philosophy of mind for anyone that's considering that topic. So first, I just want to kind of recap some of the information that we did on Wednesday, and then we'll continue from there. So when we were Wednesday, we were talking about the article by J.J.C. Smart, which is called Sensations and Brain Processes. So he was defending physicalism, and here's what he said. He started off by saying that if physicalism is not true, and if dualism instead is true, that's, he thinks, problematic, because it means that there's something in the universe that's not capable of being explained physically, namely consciousness. And if that is so, then consciousness and thought, experience, perception, it would somehow just defy any kind of physical explanation. And in that sense, it would be what he calls a nomological dangler. Nomological dangler, if you remember, is just something that is not yet explained or understood according to the physical sciences. So, you know, if consciousness was like some sort of mysterious non-physical thing, like a ghost or a soul or whatever, then science would never be able to fully master an explanation of it. And he says, why should we accept that the universe is split into two parts? One part that's physical and operates according to physical and natural laws, and then this other element that's something that's completely detached from the physical, namely, you know, perception and consciousness. So he's out to show that consciousness is physical, and his essential claim is that sensations are equivalent to brain processes. Sensations equal brain processes. So his terminology here, sensations, just refers to any conscious state of the mind at all. So that could be laughter, pain, pleasure, experience of eating food, or, you know, taking a walk, watching a movie, going on a run. Whatever conscious state your mind could ever be in, that's labeled a sensation. And he's arguing that all the sensations, whatsoever they are at the end of the day just brain processes, which are essentially, you know, physical things, physical states of the physical brain. And he then tries to defend this position against what he considers to be some of the better objections that dualists could present. And I just took you on a little tour through some of the objections. We didn't hit all of them, but I think we talked about the ones that were the most important, except for one that I left off that I wanted to go into today. But just briefly, you know, one of the objections was, how can the conscious mind and the brain be the same thing? Because I'm able to talk about my sensations, just everyday talk, but I can't tell you anything really about what's happening inside of the brain. And you would think that if these two things are actually the same, then I would be able to talk about both of them with equal, you know, ease. But I can't. I can only really speak much about what I'm experiencing, but I can't tell you how it equates to a brain process. But he says this is not a great objection, because in the same way, some people don't know what electricity is, but when they look at lightning, they can talk about it. Or in the past, people didn't know that the evening star and the morning star were the same object, and they had two labels with different meanings attached to those, you know, two descriptions of the same object. So anyway, sometimes language can invent more than one name for a single object, or more than one description for a single object. And that's essentially what he says, that there could be, you know, more than one word that refer to the same thing. And that's kind of a theme that keeps popping up throughout his stated replies to these objections. Another one is the words brain process and sensation don't convey the same meaning. So how could they really be the same thing? And again, he reminds you that sometimes words can have different meaning linguistically, but still just refer to the same object in the world. And he also talked about how sensations are private; they can't be, experienced or seen by others, but a brain process can be. So how could those two things be the same? And again, he reminds you that there's just a linguistic difference in the way we talk about our sensations versus a publicly observable brain process. But those linguistic differences don't amount to a physical difference of two things. The last one, I just wanted to get into this before I move on from Mr. JJC Smart, was objection 7. And this is, I think, an important one. That's why I didn't want to leave it behind. Because you can think of this as kind of like the Cartesian objection, the objection that Descartes would give to any argument for physicalism. And it's essentially linked to his own argument for dualism. It's the point that I can clearly imagine my mind and my body existing separately, and therefore they must not be the same thing. Okay, so the objection stated here is, I can imagine my mind and my body existing in separate, existences. I can imagine them being divided, being separated, existing separately. So if I can imagine this, they must not be the same thing. Remember, Descartes kind of hammered this point home. He said, anytime you can clearly conceive of two things existing separately, whether or not they happen to be attached for now, if you can clearly conceive of them existing separately, then that ensures that they can be separated, because God makes sure that clear and distinct perceptions are true, because he's perfectly good and he's not a deceiver, and that's one of the clear and distinct perceptions, so he claims. So what about that? Is this something that debunks or defeats the physicalist position that sensations are just brain processes, because basically we can imagine ourselves having sensations even if we didn't have any brain or any body at all? Well, in reply to this, he basically says, I can also imagine that the morning star is not the evening star. I can imagine that. And in fact, people did believe that for some time until they discovered that it was the same object. So, just being able to imagine that two things are distinct does not necessarily mean that the labels of language refer to two different things. And he also says this. He says that, okay, if the person believes that they can conceive of the mind and the body existing separately, then what they think the mind must be is something that can be completely separated from the physical body and brain. Therefore, this is, he claims, like a ghost theory of consciousness. It's a theory of consciousness which says that your own thought and perception somehow inhabits like a ghostly form that has no material form at all. And his kind of final word is this. He says, in a way, I can't conclusively disprove the ghost theory of consciousness, right, as he calls it. But he says, if this is a theory of consciousness and this is what someone suggests is true, then you have to compare it to alternative theories. And so what he says basically is, if you go with the ghost theory of consciousness, that consciousness comes from like a mysterious ghostly substance, then as an alternative to that, he advises or advances the brain theory of consciousness. And he just thinks that there's much more empirical support for a brain theory of consciousness than for a ghost theory. So like kind of in the end, he says, take your pick, basically. The dualist is offering you a ghost theory of consciousness. The physicalist has a brain theory of consciousness, and he just believes that if that's the set of choices that you have, that you're going to rationally break in favor of the brain theory of consciousness because it just seems so much more eminently justified. Okay, so But the, if I may, I'm just going to direct with arrows the final point in this sentence here. But the brain theory of consciousness is better supported by evidence. Okay, so what I've written here says this. His reply to the objection, which said, I can, objection 7, I can imagine my mind and body existing separately, so they mustn't be the same thing. Response, but hold on, one can also imagine that the morning star and the evening star are not the same thing, but they actually are. So the point then is that even if one can imagine or just conceive of the possibility that two labels for something refer to two distinct objects, that's not always true. And then furthermore, this presents us with a ghost theory of consciousness, that the separate existence of the mind detached from the body could really happen. That employs or embodies a ghost theory of consciousness, and all he says is the brain theory of consciousness is just more reasonable, better supported by evidence. So I'll read just the last couple things from that, and then we'll be on to the last author on this topic. So here's the stated objection. I can imagine myself being turned to stone and still having images, aches, pains, and so on. And then he replies, well, I can imagine that the electrical theory of lightning is false. I can imagine that lightning is not electricity. I can imagine that the evening star is not the morning star, but it is. All this shows is that the terms experience and brain process don't have the same linguistic meaning, but it does not show that an experience is not in fact a brain process. And then he goes down a little bit further. He says, the dualist cannot really say that an experience can be composed out of nothing, for he holds that experiences are something over and above material processes, that is, they are some sort of ghost stuff. I say the dualist hypothesis makes sense, but I say that experiences are not ghost stuff, but brain stuff. And this is another hypothesis, in my view, a more plausible one. So this is how he kind of concludes his discussion. There's one more objection after that, but I feel that we've touched on the essentials from JJC Smart. So that kind of closes that chapter of our class, or that one, I should say, author's article. So just a last summary statement about it. He set out to show that that physicalism is true. He thinks dualism is weird because it says that there's something that cannot be explained through physics and science, and that would be consciousness. And if that was actually the case, then it would be a nomological dangler, which scientists just don't like because it represents a failure of explanation scientifically. So he says, there's no real good reason, therefore, to be a dualist, but let's see what the objections to the claim that sensations are just brain processes could be. And then he states various objections that he imagines a dualist might make, some of the ones that we've talked about, like, we can't talk about them the same way, brain process and sensations, or, you can't see my sensations. They seem not to have a physical location, but the brain process does. Can't I imagine myself still having conscious states, even if I had no body at all? And, he gives a full range of philosophical replies to all those. Okay, so much then for the man JJC Smart. Now there's one more author on the topic, and so before we head off for the break, hope you guys have a good, safe, and healthy holiday. We're going to talk about the last author on this. So now we're just dealing with Alan Turing. Alan Turing. So this is a British computer scientist, code breaker, and philosopher. In the first half of the 20th century, he lived from 1912 till 1954. By the way, have any of you guys, by chance, anybody seen the movie The Imitation Game? Nobody? I mean, it's not a ton of people here, so it's, the odds aren't great, I guess. But if you have, let me know. Oh, you have seen it. Okay, good, Senna. So then you would have at least some background knowledge about this figure, Alan Turing. The whole movie's about him, and Benedict Cumberbatch won an Oscar for his portrayal of Alan Turing. In that movie, they focused more on his work assisting the Allies when we were fighting in World War II against the Nazis in Germany. He was an early computer scientist way back in the day when computers were just starting to even exist. And computers at that time would be like the size of, your garage, with less computing power than the pocket calculator that we have today. But we had to start somewhere, and he was one of the early pioneers of it. In fact, he's often credited with being the primary inventor of the digital computer. So here we are using computers every day. It's a hallmark of just global culture and life and technology. So we all, I think, have a big debt of gratitude for Turing and others who helped pave the way for these, groundbreaking discoveries. He was I don't know if you know much about his biography. Some of you have seen the movie, I guess, but to the others, let me just say a few things, since I always try to introduce facts about the author. So you know that he worked to help defeat the Nazis by working with Britain and the United States to break codes. He was trying to intercept cryptographs that were being sent by the Axis powers, and he was good at that. That would allow him to intercept messages and prevent successful attacks being waged against our forces and all of that. He was also, so he had a kind of tragic end of his life, though, in a way. So you can see he died kind of young. He was 42. And he was a gay man during his life, okay? And back then, this is certainly before more, I guess, enlightened attitudes towards the LGBTQ community, which has developed a lot more in the past even 20 years, but certainly much since 1954. Anyway, he was kind of persecuted for that because he was known to be gay, and he was actually forced under a court order to take a cocktail of chemicals that will basically destroy your sexual drive. So it's like chemical castration, pretty much. And they did that because it was considered like a sexual crime or deviance to be an open gay person. Well, anyway, so he suffered through that, and he actually died of cyanide poisoning. It's ruled suicide. Of course, some people may harbor their own suspicions about whether there could have been another reason he was poisoned, but basically it seems like he committed suicide. But yes, he's left us with some great work, though. And one of his papers is what we're going to actually talk about today. So it's from 1950. And it's called Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence from Alan Turing, 1950. So let's just kind of see the bigger picture here of what he's going to try and address. He's the man who's primarily responsible for the invention of the computer. And he was having the thought, even back then when computers were really unsophisticated and not too powerful, he thought, someday, I believe machines like computers basically will be able to think, have consciousness. This part of the class is all about consciousness and the mind. It's philosophy of mind. So that's a question that we said we would deal with. What is it? Could a computer ever actually have consciousness like what we have got? Or is that not possible? Alan Turing wants to, explore this question. Could machines ever think? And just to sort of preview his own answer to that, he's going to give the argument that yes, that not in 1950, but at some future time when machines are sufficiently powerful in terms of their processing power and data speed, that they will actually have consciousness and that they would be functionally equivalent to a human brain or even more powerful than that. And they would have real thoughts, feelings, experiences like we have got. But we've got to see how he reaches that conclusion. It's certainly something that can be debated, and he also goes through objections to the point. So, can machines think? Could they ever think? He says, let's make the question a little less ambiguous. Let's make the question a little bit more precise as to whether machines could think. He says the best way to pursue this question is by thinking about the idea of what is called the imitation game. So let me first of all describe for you what the imitation game is on this board, and then I'll give some more commentary from Turing. Okay, so the imitation game. Okay, so now look, I'm going to first explain the imitation game as it is used as like a party game. So there's one version of the imitation game that has nothing to do with the question of whether machines have consciousness or not. There's one version of it that's just kind of like a silly game that people can play like at a party when they have people in attendance and they want to have some kind of fun activity to do. So I first want to talk to you about the like original imitation game, which is just played with humans, like a party game. And then that's going to build a bridge for us to understand the real version of the imitation game that's important for this lecture and for this author, the version involving a computer and human. Okay, but first of all, let's talk about the human version of it. If you choose to write on this later, or if you report on the imitation game, like if I asked it on a question or something on a test, I just want you to know that you could probably just skip over this first human one and go straight to the one involving computers in your explanation, because that's the only one that's really relevant to this topic. But for the explanation of that, for me to give you an explanation, I do have to walk you through this initial version of it, okay? So here we go. The imitation game is as follows. It's played with three people. You have one subject, A, another subject, B, and then over here, on the other side of a wall, you have a third subject labeled C. Now let's just say that A is a man, and B is a woman. I know that men and women don't necessarily always look like these stereotypical stick figures, but I'm just trying to give a quick description here. So A is a man, B is a woman, and C, it doesn't matter, it could be either gender. Let's just say it's a man for the sake of discussion. All right, now, here's the way the game is played. C is in the role of the interrogator in the game. Okay, so that's his position and that's his job, to be the interrogator. And he has a simple goal, okay? His goal is to ask questions to A and B, right? So he'll get like a 5-minute interview with A, and he can ask any questions that he wants. Then after he's done with that, he moves on to the second person, B, and he gets to interview them for 5 minutes and ask them whatever he wants. After the 2 interviews are done, and he's finished with his questions and he's gotten his answers back, he has to make a determination, he has to judge which one was the man and which one was the woman. So basically that's one question that he can't just ask them, or at least if he does, he might not receive a correct answer, because that's something that he's trying to determine based on the nature of the answers that he gets back. Now, let me tell you about how they are playing the game, A and B. Okay, so remember, his goal is to determine, is A the man or the woman? Is B the man or the woman? He knows one is a man and one is a woman, and he's just not told in advance which of the two it is. Now, B is a woman, and she's just going to answer questions naturally in the way that she would as a woman. A, though, is a man, and here's what A is trying to do. A is trying to basically trick C into thinking that he is actually the woman, okay? Even though he is a man, he's trying to give answers back to C that he thinks would make C give the wrong interpretation at the end. So what's a win for C? A win for C is if he finishes the interview and he correctly identifies that A was the man and B was the woman, despite the imitation that A is giving of a woman's type of answers. And he loses the game, the interrogator, if he misidentifies the cases. So if he were to say this is a woman and this is a man, then he would have gotten it wrong. And that would be, like, in the game, a loss. Okay, now I have a couple more questions for you. How would the answers be submitted and received back? In what medium do you think? These answers would be both questions being delivered and answers returned. How do you think we would transmit the questions and answers in this game so that there's a challenge to the game? Someone will know this, I think, if you just reason through it and think. Okay, good, Senna, written or in a text-based format. Why so? Why would they be best delivered and received as text instead of speech? You're correct, yes, they are written. But why? Why is that important to the way the game is played? Just so we're on the same page. So they can't hear the different voices. Perfect, yes. That would make the game silly and no challenge at all. If he could just hear A with its stereotypically male voice and B with the feminine voice, that would make the game easy to solve. So it makes it a little tougher, right, that he can only receive written answers back. and he can only deliver written questions over. Why is he on the other side of the wall? That's also clear enough, but I want to be the one that tells me, so I'm sure you understand. Why do you think that we have placed a partition between A, B, and C? There's a wall between them. It's blocking their vision. So why is that? Why is that important to our little game here? The reason for the wall? Anybody? What do you think? Good. So he can't see them either. Yeah, because if he could just see the person, of course, there's no game to be played then. You just look and you just identify visually. So it's all about the nature of the answers that are given back. Okay, and that makes it so that he has a little bit of a challenge. Now, A, remember, they're trying to imitate the characteristic answers that a woman would give. So if C asks A a question, I don't want to rely too much on gender stereotypes, but I guess it's kind of unavoidable in this version of the game. So suppose that C asks A this question, because C's trying to probe around for information in the answers that might give away which gender the person is. So maybe he says to A, so A, tell me, what's your favorite movie? And then maybe, A is a man, but it's trying to give a female answer. What do you think could be an answer that A might choose to give them, so that he reinforces the perception that he's actually a woman when he gives the answer? You're playing the game. Imagine that. You're the person behind the wall. You're A. You receive this question. Tell me your favorite movie. And if you're the man answering the question, trying to induce the belief that this is a woman, you might say such a thing as what? I don't want to put you on the hook, okay, this exposes your view of what kind of movies women generally like or something, but it's just an explanation. Some romantic movie or, like a rom-com. You basically, I'm not saying women all like those movies, and of course they don't. But if we're going off of stereotypes, then there's a stereotypically more masculine or more feminine genre, according to, heteronormative categories of men and women. So A would probably give an answer like something like that. If A says, Fast and Furious, or, the new Michael Bay movie or something, then that might make it seem like, I'm not sure. That seems more like an answer that the man might have given. Okay, all right. So now you understand the game when it's played with humans. But I'm reminding you now that this is just a little building block. This is just a bridge to the real version of the game that matters for this essay. Okay, so now I want you to think about it like this. Let's replace the man here with a machine, a computer. Okay, so A is an advanced computing system that can engage with you in a chat. So it's like a chat bot. Now, the game's a little different. It's the similar format to the game, but I want you to tell me, what's the nature of the goal of the interrogator now? So he gets 5-minute interviews or so, the interval of time, let's just say it's 5 minutes. It could be a little more or less, but suppose he gets to have his 5-minute interview with individual A and then with individual B. After he's done, the interrogator has to judge what question in this real version of the imitation game used to judge whether machines have consciousness. He's trying to make what call in this case? I've replaced the man with a computer. So what's the goal of the interrogator in the game if it is played with these subjects? Who is the human and who is the computer? Perfect. Yes, Megan, that's right. So after he has completed his questions, he tries to make the call. He tries to determine which one is which, who is who. Is A a man, or human, I should say, or is A a computer? So in this version of the game, a win for C is the correct identification, saying of A that A is a computer and saying of B that B is a human being. Now, since this is a set of questions and interrogation that's trying to make that judgment call, he's going to ask questions that sort of expose his thought about, what kind of answers a human or a machine would give. So maybe he will ask A something like, tell me about your greatest fear. Have you ever been in love? What do you like to do for fun? What's your favorite song? Tell me about your mom. All kinds of stuff like that. So he's trying to get answers back that will allow him to make a judgment about whether that was a real, authentic human or robot. Okay, now, let me tell you, here's what Alan Turing believes about this game. He says, if and when we reach a point, okay, in the future, because he's writing in 1950, keep that in mind, but he says, if and when, to him it's really more when than if, because he sees no reason this can't happen. He believes that inevitably in the future, we will have powerful enough computers to do this, but he says in the future, basically, we will reach a point, and if we do, when we reach the point where the interrogator fails to correctly identify these two subjects about 50% of the time, then at that point, we will say these are thinking computers. These are thinking machines that have got consciousness. So the Turing test, as it's sometimes also called, that's another name for it, the Turing test. I just want to tell you that because if you ever find it interesting to study a little more of this, if you look into like artificial intelligence labs or journals or just media accounts of it that you find online, you'll often see a lot of it listed under this heading of the Turing test. Because in the decades ever since he wrote this, it's kind of famously been taken up by his namesake, is the Turing test. So this Turing test or imitation game, whatever you call it, is what Turing thinks we would do to determine whether and when computers have got consciousness. When do they have consciousness? When misidentification occurs at about a 50% rate. Because if you're failing to give the right answer about half of the time, then you can't tell the difference between the two things. It's sort of at that point like flipping a coin. Who's the human, who's the computer? I can't tell. Half the time I get it right, half the time I get it wrong. So it's just a wash. And that means that if you can't tell the difference between human answers and the answers given by the computer, then they're indistinguishable from the type of answers that a human would give. And he says that's the only possible criteria there could be for whether a machine has consciousness. So let me just put his point here and say it clearly. According to Turing, this is true. When we reach a point where the interrogator misidentifies about 50% of the time in the game involving, computer and a human, when we reach that point, then computers have consciousness and are thinking things. Okay, so why does he set the number around 50%? Because suppose that you could correctly identify the cases 90% of the time, and only 10% of the time did you get it wrong. Well, that doesn't seem like the computer's doing well enough in the game yet. 9 out of 10 times you can tell it's a computer. You would say, well, that's not really very similar in a way to human answers, because maybe when I'm like a little tired or not paying good enough attention, 10% of the time I might make the wrong call. But most of the time I'm getting it. And so it's really only when reliability in giving the correct answer drops down to such a level that there's no reliability that we would say now you cannot tell the difference, and therefore this is a thinking machine. He predicted in 1950 that by the time we got to the year 2000, 50 years ahead of him, he thought that the machines that we had at that time would be powerful enough to fool the interrogator about 30%, 25 to 30% of the time. But he believed that as computers, continued to get more developed, that it would just be a slow and steady or even just fast march towards the status quo that he's anticipating. And it's 2020 now. We're actually much, much closer to the fulfillment of his prediction today than he ever was in his own life. Because as you guys know, machines and computers are getting quite sophisticated. A lot of us have, little voice assistants, whether it's Google or Siri or any other number of voice assistant chatbots. There's also like a whole industry of artificial intelligence chatbots that compete in the Loebner competition every year. The most sophisticated one that's out there, if you want to really trip out on something kind of strange, find online this robot, Mitsuku, and chat with her. When I have more time in this segment of the class and I had an extra meeting, I would often do the imitation game, the Turing test, with you guys by literally having an interview where you guys ask questions and I'm the one moderating the discussion between you and another subject. And I don't tell you whether you're dealing with Mitsuku or with a human being. And you'd be surprised that when I've actually done this test in live class settings, it's not necessarily that everyone gets it correct, who is the human and who's the computer, because Mitsuku keeps improving every year. Her answers are very realistic, almost eerie in a way. And I've seen a case in a couple classes where almost half the class or even the majority gave the wrong answer. So anyway, I'm just saying that he's kind of a visionary in a sense, because he was not dealing with computers that could actually do the things that he was predicting they would someday be able to do. But now we're a lot closer to that. Okay, so he thinks this is the right way to test whether machines have consciousness, because by establishing the barrier, you can't be led to think, oh, well, it doesn't look like a human, so I know it doesn't have consciousness, right? That's an irrelevant factor. If it just looks like metal and wires, that doesn't tell you that it can't actually think. So he says, you know, one feature of the imitation game, the barrier, eliminates the visual appearance from being a considered factor in whether it has consciousness. Also, ensuring that the messages are sent and delivered via text is another thing that makes sure that it's just the content of the information they give back that you're judging, instead of, let's say, the timbre of their voice. Because like if the robot had a characteristically robotic sounding voice, then that would be a dead giveaway that you're talking to the robot. Now, by making it, you know, structured in the way the imitation game is, we make sure that irrelevant factors that don't have anything to do with the question of whether it's conscious enter into the judgment. Okay, in the next part of his essay, he says that the machines that are going to be used in the game may be of any type as long as they are not a human brain. And I find that to be, it's almost a strange comment, because you would hear that and think, well, of course, the machines used in the game are computers. They're not humans. But this is, I think, for you, a little insight into the way that Turing thinks. Turing basically believes that the human brain is itself just a naturally occurring, like organic, biological computer made out of, you know, neurons and blood vessels and brain tissue, but that it's essentially a computer created by nature. So when he says we can use any computer that we'd like in the game to play the role of the first subject or whatever, he means digital computers, not human brains born through, you know, sexual reproduction. Okay, and then after that, he goes into a brief discussion of how the digital computer is structured. He's telling the audience that because, again, he's writing in 1950. Not even everybody in 1950 understood what a computer is or what it was supposed to do. So he was trying to give a basic description of how it is in some ways parallel to features of the human brain. So he compares two cases, what he calls the human computer, in other words, the brain, with the digital computer. So let me go over that. He refers to like three main parts of the human computer. Okay, so there is, I should say three parts, three aspects is better, because sometimes he describes them as parts and other times he describes them as features. So one of them is the human computer follows fixed rules. Okay, and he says that the rules, quote unquote, are supplied in a book, which is like a metaphor, but the rules are contained in a book. And we have, the book has infinite paper, as he says. Okay, so about the brain, as he would label it, the human computer. One feature of that brain, or human computer, is that it follows fixed rules. So everything you do is done according to some kind of rule structure, right? Like, so for me to even be talking to you right now, I can't just be like blah, 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 like saying random stuff that has no meaning. I have to use words in accordance with the vocabulary and the grammar of the English language. If I'm playing a guitar, right, I have to do so in accordance with a particular precise set of rules that allows music to be generated by the way that I handle the instrument. Even just walking, right? Right foot, left foot, lift the knee, lower it towards the ground, keep your balance, maintain your stride. These things happen according to rules. We don't consciously think of the rules at every stage, but it's not haphazard or random behavior either. The only time your behavior ceases to follow any kind of rational rule is when you lose your mind and you're doing things that make no sense at all, like just running around in a circle, hitting your head on a wall. But anything that you do that is rational, coherent, like the vast bulk of your own behavior, goes according to some kind of rule that can be expressed. Okay? The second thing is that these rules, he claims, are contained in a book. Now, not literally a book, but he's employing a metaphor. In 1950, the people reading his essay didn't have computers yet. So what would be the go-to example that you would use if you're trying to explain to people that there's like basically memory storage capacity in the mind? You wouldn't be able to say, oh, we got a big hard drive where we have a bunch of files, which is perhaps a more common metaphor today. But people have books, right? Books contain information. So all he's saying is that the information where the rules and other things are stored in the mind, and we could call it like a so-called book, a storage basin of information and facts and data. And then third, the so-called book has infinite paper, meaning that this is a book which kind of has indefinitely many pages. There's no limit to how much information you can acquire, except for natural limitations of like your lifespan and whatever. So it's not like for you to learn philosophy or something or to learn a new topic, you have to clear files out from your brain. Like my hard drive of the brain is getting too full, so I need to delete everything that I know about like studying Spanish so that I can now learn French. It doesn't work that way. You can just keep piling on new information onto the things that you've learned before. So us, compared to like a digital computer, I guess we just have vastly much more and maybe even open-ended storage capacity. Now he says these three aspects of the human computer are in some ways parallel to three aspects of the digital computer, which of course he's like a pioneering inventor of. And so in similar ways, he refers to these three parts of the digital computer. There's a store of info that's like the hard drive that contains all the information. There's the executive unit. That's the like CPU basically that carries out the instructions and executes them according to the information contained in the store of info. And then there's what he calls a control unit, which basically makes sure that the rules and instructions are obeyed in a rational, logical ordering instead of in some kind of random order. And so computers, he's telling the reader, have been constructed according to principles which allow them to mimic the actions of a human brain. And that allows us to, what can I say, like defer intellectual labor to the machines that we otherwise would have had to do. So, you know, think about how many things machines can do for us today that human brains would have had to basically engineer or produce in the past, whether that's creating graphs, blueprints, analyzing data, creating models, running simulations. These are things that would have had to be done with human beings and paper and pen and so on in the past. So they're quite useful. Now, he also mentions that the digital computers are what are called discrete state machines. What that means is that it's in a definite state at each given moment, and each new state of the system is a function of the prior state plus an input signal. Okay, so a discrete state machine is a machine which is in exactly one state at a given time. And the reason that it's in that state is because of two factors: what the prior state was and an input signal that you give it. And that's how all digital computers always work. So like, for example, here's my, let's use this as an example of a digital computer. It's my cell phone, which is essentially a pocket computer. It's right now it's in this state of being turned off. But now, if I push the power button, you'll see my lock screen shown with the time indicated and all that. Now, why is it in this state right now? Well, because of two things. What was the prior state? Being off. And what was the input signal? Pressing the power button which provides this new state of the system. And if I say swipe, what you'll see is, let me go to my home screen, you'll see my home screen instead of the lock screen. So why is it now in the home screen? Because the previous state of the system was lock screen, and then I applied an input signal, which was swiping. When you use the internet and you do an internet search, you type in a search term into the search bar, and then you hit the enter key. Now you see the results displayed on the screen. That's the state of the machine. Why is it in that state? Because the prior state was search term being entered and the input signal was hitting the return key. You play a video game and you beat the boss and it shows congratulations. That state of the system is unlocked by having just been in the previous state of fighting the boss and doing whatever input signal to the controller that results in that function of the system defeating the boss. Okay, so discrete state machines can mimic the behavior of any other machine exactly if they can display at least as many states. So his question is sort of this: could a discrete state machine do well enough in the imitation game to cause this reliable misidentification at 50% rate? And he does say yes, that's going to happen someday in the future. The only last thing from this paper that now is remaining left over are what some objections are and how he replies back to those objections. So there's a couple that I did want to talk to you about. There's the mathematical objection, the objection from consciousness, and Lady Lovelace's objection. So let me just quickly try and talk to you about a few of these points. And when we return from our break, I can mention some of them again as a summary review. The mathematical objection says that for technical reasons, there are certain questions that if you ask the machine, it would never be able to return an answer. Kurt Gödel is a famous logician and mathematician of the 20th century who basically proved what's called the undecidability theorem. What that theorem shows is that within any mathematical system or computer programming language, there are going to be certain questions that it cannot answer from within the system. I don't know, not a perfect example, but a somewhat fair example of this is if you try to ask a calculator to divide by 0, it cannot return a value because that's an undefined mathematical operation. So, if you're dealing with one of these computers in the imitation game, maybe if you asked it a question like that it could not answer, it would say it would either time out or say it cannot compute. And you think maybe that's a reason to say that they're not really conscious, because humans are not like that. We can answer any question, or at least try to. But a machine, for technical reasons, there would be some questions that would outstrip its ability to even state an answer. Well, Turing replies back to that. And here is his kind of just clap back response. He says, but the human brain also has limitations too. We don't always think about it, but there are also certain questions that your brain cannot answer if I ask you about them. So for example, what's the biggest number? Tell me that one. You can't say. I mean, you might try to say infinity, but if you take the power set of infinity, like that is, raise it to the next power, then you have a larger set of infinity with a higher cardinality. So it's impossible to give a number. What if I ask you, has the universe always been there, or did it have a beginning in time? It's kind of hard to give any answer because both of them sort of are mind-boggling. So you could argue that there's also questions that surpass the ability of even the human brain to answer. And therefore, he's saying that there's no real difference between us and the computer. We, just as well as the computer, are subject to limitations in our ability to answer any type of conceptual question. There are some questions that go past our limits to answer them. Another objection was called the objection from consciousness. And it says machines could imitate human behavior. Like they could even write poems or songs or tell you that they had that they're depressed, but they wouldn't actually have any feelings inside. There wouldn't actually be any real feelings. They would just be, behaving on the basis of a program. And there's no real experience or sensation inside. He says in reply to that, Turing, how could you really know that though? The only way you can ever determine if anything has consciousness is by observing the behavior of the thing. Because first-person consciousness, having sensations, you only have access to your own. Every other human being, you have to look at them based on the way they behave and judge if they're conscious or not. So he says it's not really fair to say I can't believe the computer has consciousness until I'm the computer feeling myself having thoughts, because that's an impossible standard to achieve. And if we judge it instead by its the nature of the way it behaves and acts, then we should just think it has consciousness. So when it walks and talks, not walks, but responds to questions and such like a human does, then it's a human, or not a human, but a conscious thing that has thought. Right, so it's like an unfair standard to impose, to say you have to be able to verify somehow from the inside out that there's sensation and consciousness there. Since that's impossible to do even with other people, he thinks that that would not be a reasonable standard. Yeah, that's about it. There's also Lady Lovelace's objection. She says they're only able to do what they've been programmed to do. And just 1 to 5 second thing. His response to that is, well, that's the same with us too. We don't think much about it, but you're also not able to act on information or even think about it until it's been given to you from an external source. So like the Turing test, I don't think you could have talked about it a month ago because you hadn't studied it yet. But now you have studied it and you can talk about it. So what's the difference? It's not the difference that you came up with the information. It's the difference that you've now read about it in a book and been taught about it by a professor. And that's how information works. If you learn a new language, then after you learn it, you can use it. But before, you can't. A baby born today does not know English, but it can learn it if it gets the right external and environmental inputs. So he says, once again, there's actually no difference. The computer and the human brain both can only do that which they're programmed to do. It can only act on information that they've been given before. So that's it. Let me say this too, to close. Important. If Turing's right and machines could think, what do you think? Does that support dualism or physicalism? Well, I gotta be quick. So it basically it's more supportive of physicalism. Because if a machine could have consciousness, then that tends to debunk the position that there's anything that's not physical about consciousness, right? If it can be engineered and man-made in a electrical system like a machine or a computer, then that means that consciousness doesn't necessarily have to do with like a soul or with something that's not physical. It would be a proof of the concept that consciousness can be discovered in something that is known to be physical, because nobody thinks a machine has a soul. Okay, so then guys, that's all I have for us. We finished now with the philosophy of mind subject. And when we come back, we will just wrap up the class with one more topic, but wishing everyone a good Thanksgiving. Hope you have a nice, healthy, and safe time. Maybe some of you will see some family. Just take reasonable precautions, mask up when you can, keep a little distance, and just have a good time. But I'll see you then. All right, everyone good? Everything's good to go. Let me know in the chat or just hit the like button or something. Okay, thanks, Senna, and everyone else. Sorry to keep you an extra minute, but have a good one, and I'll see you back after the break. We'll be in touch between now and then if you need anything. Okay, bye-bye.